Greenland, the world's largest island, blanketed by ice 2 miles thick, where glaciers meet the sea and icebergs choke the fjords. For more than 1,000 years, settlers have called this marginal land home. Amidst the scattered dwellings of today's residents lies a mystery from the past. These stones are all that remain of a lost Viking civilization. About 1,000 years ago, the Vikings, Norsemen from Norway, established a colony in Greenland. For almost 5 centuries they flourished here. Then they suddenly disappeared. They left behind a riddle that scientists, historians, and archaeologists have all failed to solve. Until now.
The colony in Greenland disappears from history in about the year 1500. Nobody knows exactly why or exactly when this happened. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Middle Ages.
The first settlement to disappear lay on the west coast of Greenland. Around 1340, a visitor from the Vikings' home in Norway sailed into this fjord. What he found shocked and amazed him. The emissary's name was Ivar Bardason.
When he arrived there, the place was empty. There was no one there. And he says in his report,
"I saw nobody, neither Christians nor heathens, only some wild cattle and sheep all running wild."
This means that the settlement was empty. The Norse Greenlanders had left or died out, probably fairly recently since the domestic animals were still there.
Bardason was the first of many who over the centuries have wondered what could have caused a once prosperous civilization to suddenly disappear. Today, 650 years later, an international team of scientists has come to Greenland hoping to find the answer. The team includes archaeologists, physicists, chemists, and botanists who are pooling ideas and resources. Among them is Dr. Bent Fredskild, a botanist who has been fascinated by the lost Vikings for more than 40 years.
It's a long story. It started 55 with my first visit, and since then I have spent 29 whole summers in different places in Greenland.
Outside the few small towns, Greenland has no roads. Like the Vikings before them, the scientists rely on boats to get around. One of the first steps in their investigation is the excavation of a key Viking site. In a remote coastal valley, a sheep farmer has stumbled across the ruins of a farmstead. The team of scientists from Scandinavia, Britain, and the United States is led by Dr. Jette Arnborg of the National Museum of Denmark.
The disappearance of the Norse Greenlanders is a mystery. Every new generation have new answers, and I think that's very exciting, and in a way that reflects that history is very much alive in our society today.
The team will camp here for a month, making the most of the few short weeks of the Arctic summer. They hope this dig will yield the answer to what really became of the Greenland Vikings. They turn to what may seem like a peculiar place to look for clues. Here they are working through a midden, or garbage dump. Every farmstead had one, and into it generations of Viking families threw their waste. Everything from leftover food to the outgrown treasures of childhood.
Can you see? It's a horseman. We don't know really what those horses were for, but we guess that they were toys, children's toys. Perhaps they had something to do with horses here, I don't know.
Every object will be dated, because the archaeologists can calculate exactly when each layer of the midden was laid down.
The very top of the transect is a layer that just came on a few years ago, and then beneath this we have a recent peat layer, and then there's the first Norse layer, one could call it, which has a lot of charcoal and bone remains in it. The Viking period is actually documented from all the way from the bottom until 15 centimeters below the recent surface.
The excavations have helped the team build up a remarkably detailed picture of life in Greenland at the height of the Viking civilization. They have gleaned further facts from an extraordinary collection of historical documents written by Icelandic scribes in the Middle Ages. These chronicle how the Norsemen first came to this unknown land, then on the outermost edge of the known world. Now preserved in this institute in Iceland, the sagas present a wider picture. They illustrate how the Vikings built an empire that extended from their homeland in Scandinavia east across Russia and south to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea.
The Icelanders in the Middle Ages were notorious for writing. They wrote much more than any of their Scandinavian neighbors. They were writing sagas about kings, legendary heroes of the Viking past, and themselves, as well as people in the Faroe Islands, the Orkneys, and in Greenland. And this is where we are told about the Greenland voyages, about the discovery of North America.
America, called Vinland by the Vikings, was the westernmost outpost of their empire. In the 1960s, archaeologists discovered and reconstructed the only known Viking settlement on the North American continent. It's at La Anse au Meadow, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Here the Vikings built houses for around 100 people. But the sagas suggest the experiment was short-lived. After perhaps as little as 3 years, constant skirmishes with the indigenous people and the difficulties obtaining supplies from Europe drove the settlers away. Of all the Viking colonies, the American was one of only 2 that failed. The other was in Greenland. The sagas record the facts of the Greenland colony's foundation, but mysteriously do not explain the settlers' disappearance.
The earliest and most reliable source tells us of a man called Eric the Red from Norway who had heard of a country to the west and sailed to find it and discovered it and called it Greenland, and then went back with 25 ships of settlers. Eric the Red settled in what's called the Eastern Settlement in Greenland. Once there was also a smaller settlement in the Western Settlement. Of the 25 ships that went to Greenland, only 14 arrived, but later colonists kept arriving after that.
The scientists have established that the Viking colonists were farmers. They lived in houses like this Icelandic reconstruction, built from turf, stone, and timber, in the style of their ancestors back in Scandinavia. The life of the Greenland Vikings was being pieced together.
They lived in small, isolated farmhouses, and you have to remember that it was dark for most of the year that far north, so they would sit indoors and amuse themselves by composing poetry, telling stories, carving toys out of wood and ivory. playing chess perhaps.
The Vikings built houses, stables, and cowsheds, hidden in sheltered valleys among the coastal hills. Each summer they grew fodder and hay for their animals on the high pastures. One task for today's archaeologists is to map these settlements. Here are the remains of a compound one farmer constructed for the sheep, cattle, and goats he'd imported from back home in Scandinavia. The ruins show that over the years the Viking population grew. Before their disappearance, up to 6,000 people occupied Greenland. In winter, the Vikings lived cheek by jowl with their animals, sheltered from the piercing Arctic cold. Unable to exercise in these cramped conditions, the animals lost the use of their legs, and when spring finally came, they had to be carried out into the fields to graze.
The Vikings lived by subsistence agriculture in Greenland, and they had to import a lot of the things that was necessary to their lifestyle. So they had to import timber for their housing, they had to import iron for the nails to build their houses with. And in order to get these from abroad, for instance from Norway, they exported Greenland falcons, which were known as far away as Sicily. They exported walrus ivory, and in the early Middle Ages this was the only source of ivory. It was exported throughout Europe and carved into beautiful objects found in churches, crucifixes, caskets and the like.
For 500 years the settlers flourished. With the money from trading, they built magnificent churches. This one at Volsay is the only one still partly standing today. As their prosperity grew, they even sent a message to the Pope in faraway Rome, telling him they needed a bishop. In exchange, they offered the gift of a polar bear. But this success did not last. In the 14th and 15th centuries, something unexpected made the Greenland Vikings disappear from their settlements.
The last known communication from Norse Greenland was in the year 1410, when a party of Icelanders arrived in Norway, having come from Greenland. While they were there, two of them decided to get married, and we have very detailed records of the wedding that took place in the church at Valsay on the 16th of September in 1408. And it said that there were many people there, both Greenlanders of Viking descent and foreigners.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
It was also done properly. The banns were read out in church for 3 weeks running before the wedding. The same Icelanders also witnessed some dramatic events while they were in Greenland. A man called Kolgrimur, who had apparently seduced a married woman using witchcraft and black arts, was sentenced to death by burning at the stake. The woman he seduced never really recovered from this experience, and she died shortly afterwards.
After this report, nothing more was heard from the Greenland Vikings. They vanished, seemingly into thin air. Today, the finds from excavations are all that archaeologists have as they seek an explanation for the mysterious disappearance. But this hasn't stopped them from toying with some extraordinary theories.
One possibility is the plague, that they died of illness and the colony was just wiped out. Another possibility is that they were kidnapped by pirates. It's also been suggested that they've intermarried with the Inuits, the native Greenlanders.
Other investigators claim the Vikings perished in a war with the Inuit. The sagas, ancient records of Arctic history, tell of battles lost by the settlers. In one, 18 Vikings lost their lives. Pioneering excavations at the beginning of the 20th century provided further valuable leads. From graves in Greenland's Viking churchyards, archaeologists recovered human bones, and farmhouse middens yielded thousands of artifacts. They even found medieval clothing, perfectly preserved in the permafrost, with their colors still fast. Now, almost a century later, the bones are finally revealing clues that may explain why the Vikings disappeared. The University of Copenhagen is the new resting place for these samples. It is also where Dr. Niels Linderup has been pursuing the mystery. A pathologist well-versed in the latest forensic methodology, he has been using modern techniques to analyze the ancient bones. And he has come away with a significant discovery.